Welcome, church. This is our Acts series video number 2. We are entering in this week to section 2. We'll be entering in for the next 2 weeks, section 2 of our Acts study, and I would like to do this little video just to introduce the chapters and get you going. The last 2 weeks, we covered chapters 1, 2 and 3, and this week we will be beginning a 2-week time in chapters 4, 5, 6 up to the beginning of chapter 8. Let me just remind you of the 2 things that we're looking for before I give you the overview of the chapters. We're looking at ultimately the main point of Acts, which I think is how God, Jesus, is carrying out his work. It's about Jesus' salvation. He has finished the work of purchasing it in his Gospels, as Luke recorded it in his Gospel, and now in Acts, he is, although he's ascended, not physically with the disciples, he is very much involved. And we're seeing, as we move through this book, just how the events that are happening could not be made by any human hand, could not be controlled or strategized, that this is God at work. So the second thing we're looking at is what it is to be the church. We are narrowing and focusing you in each section into one aspect of what it is to be the church. These next 2 weeks, we're looking at the aspect of, or the characteristic of, sacrifice. That the church is called to be picking up its cross, bearing his cross, and following Jesus. In these 4 chapters that we're looking at this week. In chapters 4, 5, and 6, we ultimately see the satanic fight back. There are a number of challenges that arise, and the church has to respond to them. In chapter 4, you see persecution arising. They get threatened. This is then repeated in chapter 5, where they're brought in again and they're beaten and almost killed. So persecution is the first challenge, and the church responds to it. The next is sin in the beginning of chapter 5 with the story of Ananias and Sapphira. And then finally in chapter 6 there is disorganization, or maybe even, discrimination that happens. And the church has to respond to that too. Now chapter 7 and 8 then move into the beginning of a couple of stories of some Greek-speaking Jews. And they're introduced to us actually back up in chapter 6 because they are the leaders that are set aside to deal with the disorganization. Stephen is the first one, then comes Philip, and we'll hear more about him in the next section. But then also this is leading and paving the way for the next very well-known guy, Paul. Okay, this is all about the church characteristic of sacrifice, and you can see that very clearly as the church has to deal with persecution. They have to be also hard on sin. They cannot allow this to come in and ruin their witness. And even with regards to dealing with people of other nations or other ways of doing stuff, they show a great deal of grace as they elect Greek-speaking Jews to deal with the situation. Ultimately, in the story of Stephen, we also see as he gives that great sermon in chapter 7 and pays for it with his life, just how he epitomizes really as the first martyr, just this picking up the cross and serving Jesus at whatever cost is required. Those are the overview. Let's see in terms of what is Jesus doing. We're following that down through here in our green line. These boxes to the right hand side. Ultimately these chapters deal a lot really with Jerusalem. There are many quotes about how there are multitudes are added in chapter 4 verses 14. Chapter 4 verses 16, it talks about people coming from all the towns around Jerusalem into Jerusalem. And even in our what is our focus passage this week in chapter 5, the Jewish leaders accused the apostles of filling Jerusalem with their teaching. And this is the first boundary that Jesus talked about back up in chapter 1, how his disciples were going to first go to Jerusalem, and then it would be Judea and Samaria, and then to the end of the world. And so here we are filling up that first boundary, filling up Jerusalem. And then as there is a persecution that kicks off at the beginning of chapter 8 with this guy Paul, Saul, then out is the command. They get out of Jerusalem, and of course they take their witness with them. And this is really exciting because we know who Paul is already. We know what's coming up. We can see how Jesus uses this persecution and even Paul himself to make sure that this good news doesn't just stay in Jerusalem, but this doesn't become just one small little area that's isolated, but this message, this movement goes way beyond, right to the end of the world. And so it is quite exciting to see. And Luke prepares us for it, I think, as he gives us little clues as he's beginning to, even in Stephen's speech, watch out for how he introduces a lot of kind of non-Jerusalem or non-Palestine little references as he helps to show the people that the right view of history is about God working and that God's plans is bigger than the people of Israel. So Luke is really preparing us throughout this, and it's really cool to see. Okay, well, when it comes to the map, there's not an awful lot to show you. Here is the city of Jerusalem. As we showed you last week, we have the ascension that happened over here towards Bethany, and we have here what would have been the upper city, possibly where the disciples were staying, was where the Holy Spirit landed on them on that Pentecost. And then here in the temple, where we ended last week, Peter and John have just healed a lame man, and there's been some massive preaching and revivaling happening here. And this is where they are arrested. A lot of the events over this period happen around the temple area and even throughout the city. Like we talked about the people coming into the city, laying their sick on the streets. But we hear a lot about how the church gathers all together. For example, in chapter 6, where they had to make that decision on how they were going to deal with this situation with the widows not being properly cared for. Well, where do you then gather when you're 6, 7, 8, 10,000 people? My assumption is that it's up here in the temple. They reference here in chapter 4, I believe. Solomon's portico is where the apostles were teaching. So I could almost imagine this whole area of the temple being taken over with the church gathering, and that's how public it really was. But it's not a lot to show you. They are arrested, they're taken at various times. Stephen and the apostles are taken to the council. The council may have met down here in the high priest's house. That's where Jesus was taken. Some are here in the upper city. We don't know. I seen one place where they talked about there even being a council building somewhere here near the temple wall. But anyway, things are happening in the city. This will be the last time we're probably going to look at Jerusalem for quite some time, because as we said, things are moving out. Okay, well that's more or less it. I just want to spend the last few minutes to talk about the focus passage. We said that this is a passage that if you wanted something to look at as a study group, as a life group, and you only had an hour or two, this would be helpful. Or even throughout the week as you study with your family and your kids are small, it might be good to just look at this one story. Now the story is found in chapter 5 this week of verses 17 to 42. It's one of those challenges we spoke about earlier that the church faces and how it responds. It's the challenge of the second time that the leadership has come against the church. This big powerful nation has come against these few kind of common guys as they preach and teach and are used by God. Now, I have a little diagram here. Hopefully it helps to lay out the structure. I think the main point is this question, or this choice that they have. They're going to either stop, because that's what the nation of Israel wants them to do, the leadership wants them to do. Are they going to stop? This is what Satan wants them to do. Or are they going to keep going? And this is the choice that they have to make. I broke it up into 3. The arrest in verses 17 to 26. This is where that also involves the story of the angel coming down and the nobody being able to find these guys, and they're out there still back on the temple preaching again in these 3 great scenes. The second passage, verses 26 to 32, is the trial where finally the chief priest gets Peter and the apostles before them, and then finally the outcome, the ruling, where Gamaliel steps in and through his influence actually the disciples are not killed and they get to leave, although they are beaten. Okay, well, as you look at each one of these, my suggestion is if you've got small kids, maybe you take one of them every evening and you have 3 studies for the week. Take a look at some literary devices. Maybe here's one suggestion. So for the first one, take a look at the scene as Luke describes it. I think he wants us to see how public this is. He repeats how those disciples are called to go stand in the temple, the most obvious place in the city, and they're called to go and stand there and preach. The choice of the church is not to be a choice where they can just have their faith, have their message, and keep it to themselves. They have to go and put themselves in the most public place and preach, and that really raises the stakes. That helps us see what this choice is really all about. In the second part, take a look at the dialogue. This part may not be as exciting as the one before and the one after. There's no angels and there's nobody getting beaten or anything, but still in the dialogue you get to see probably the most instructive. It's probably the most instructive to us as to what's happening, what's Jesus doing, and what's the church's perspective to be. And you can see there why. Why do they make the choice to keep going? And it's very interesting. It has to do with authority, it has to do with the work of Jesus. There you go. And the final one, take a look at the literary device of the contrast. Yes, here I think this is about God preserving, intervening through this guy Gamaliel, that his disciples are not killed. But also it presents this interesting contrast. Because I think Gamaliel, although he does say, oh, I don't want, don't watch out, you're not opposing God, I don't think he really has a heart for God. I think his ultimate heart is for his own self-preservation. And that presents quite a good contrast to the sacrifice the church is willing to make. As you can see them leaving and rejoicing in that really convicting verse of how they were rejoicing at being considered worthy of kind of being dishonoured for the sake of Jesus. Well, those are some thoughts. I barely scratched the surface, but I hope I've introduced enough, helped you get going, and I wish you the best study, and I'll see you on Sunday.